Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to the third meeting of our lecture series on perspectives on violence in the 21st century, organized by Reiss, the Research Center on the Transformations of Political Violence. My name is Felix Anderl. I co-organized this lecture series together with my colleague Mariel Reiss. We both work at the Center for Conflict Studies here in Marburg, and Reiss is a collaborative research center with 4 other institutions in peace and conflict studies here in Hesse. Today, I have the pleasure to welcome Marsha Henry. It's really nice that you made your way from the UK to give a lecture here. I'm really happy and proud we attract such great people to Marburg to give talks. Dr. Marsha Henry is assistant professor at the London School of Economics in the gender department. Her interests are gender and development, gender and militarization, and qualitative methodologies. For everyone like me who is interested in ethnography, I do recommend her book, Being in the Field, Theory, Practice, and Ethnography. Unlike other methodology books, Being in the Field really focuses on sharing genuine experiences of what it's like to be in the field. And that's something I really appreciate. It's really hands-on. And that's also speaking to Marsha's research more generally. I think it's always very lively. It's complicated, but it's presented in a way that you can really feel it and live through the experience. So I think that's really quite something. Really exemplary in a way, and she focuses on intersectional feminist critiques of military subjectivities and militarization. That's also going to be the topic today. The talk is called Critical Interventions, the Gendered, Racialized, and Militarized Politics of Peacekeeping. And having said that, welcome, thanks for coming, and yeah, everybody else also welcome and enjoy Marsha's lecture.
Thank you very much, everybody, for being here. Thanks. I have to start with all the thanks, but mention a couple of names of people. I want to thank Felix for organizing this. And I think these events now in person are quite complicated to arrange, despite not being so far away, being relatively close, geographically speaking. Anna Rourke helped fill in quite a lot of forms to be able to be here. Marika Henschel, Mariel Reiss, and Susanna. Where are you? Susanna Buckley-Zistel, and all those associated with Reiss and the Center for Conflict Studies at Marburg University, and all of you here today. Thank you very much for showing up. I hope I don't disappoint. I have quite a lot of pictures and a lot of what we would say in English are gripes about the field. So I hope you'll appreciate this opportunity that you can perhaps share with me in complaining about all the things you find wrong with scholarly fields. And actually what you can do is when you have 20 years of that, then you can just put it all down in a book. And that's one way, that's one methodology that you didn't share that I like to use, but I think it's exemplified in the title. So I guess the title of the book project is Critical Interventions, and none of my colleagues in gender studies department like this title. So you may not see this title on the actual book. Everyone keeps telling me it sounds like you're doing some kind of addiction intervention. It sounds like it's going to be a book about addictions. And so it's never going to come up on any Google searches in your field. Other people say it sounds like it could be part of critical gender or gender critical approaches, which are often categorized as anti-trans or or transphobic approaches or anti-gender approaches. So I definitely need to change it. So if anybody has any ideas at the end of this talk about, one colleague recently suggested at a workshop that maybe the title should just be really literal, like Peacekeeping Ruins Lives. but I somehow think that's not going to be a good marketing sort of strategy for the book. And maybe not a lot of people will buy it if that's the title, but I guess that would be in some ways quite a literal title for the book. So, okay, so a little bit of background to how I got to this, this place. So, no, sometimes that happens, but it just takes a little while. Okay.
Sorry for that.
No, it's okay. It gets stuck often, and I only use the right arrow. Okay, so
okay, now it should work.
Yeah. Okay. So I was struck by this term intervention as a way of thinking about my contribution to the field in this book project. And when I was looking up, you know, so I've used other terms in thinking about what I do in the book and in the talk today. I mean, I thought about resuscitation because part of what I'm doing is trying to revive the sort of critical perspectives of various scholars who have written on peacekeeping and sort of bring those ideas back into focus and back into a sort of wider, more democratic discussion about peacekeeping's limitations. And when I was looking up different words that I could use to think about the kind of work that I'm doing, I was very much struck by intervention and the example of used by the American dictionary here. So the intervention by UN troops prevented fighting from breaking out. And again, that was very ironic because I think that's often the very neutralizing way in which UN peacekeeping practices are thought about. They're thought about as sort of inherently, but also in an unspoken way, good for the purpose of saving lives. Okay, so I worked on this research project with a couple of other people in 2004. It started in 2003. And this project was to explore gender relations in peacekeeping missions. And so what we wanted to do, the group of us working on it, what we wanted to do was to look at what were the social relations between local people and troops, mainly military, but also police, international military and police who were sent to various humanitarian projects. And as soon as we got there, there had been a load of sort of UN changes, and they tried to reform some kinds of behavior, military and police behavior in those missions. So we were originally interested in looking at sexual relations between local people and peacekeepers. We wanted to try and understand if this was, you know, to what extent this was happening, how insecure populations were as a result of it. But when we got there, it wasn't possible to actually research that because the UN had sort of been scolded, publicly scolded, for not controlling the ways in which troops were behaving and some of the ill effects of that. So we couldn't really do that. So we started to work on this project from a much more spatial perspective, which was very much generated by the people that we spoke to. So local people who I refer to in the book as the peace kept. And I think that term, although it sounds very objectifying and marginalizing in some ways, I use it because I want to draw attention to the very stark power relations between the UN as an institution, the peacekeeping personnel who are military, police, and civilian, and their relationships with local people, which are very unequal for the most part. So we started to look at more how people perceived security and insecurity vis-a-vis the spaces they were in. So if they were in rural regions or remote regions, did they feel like they were protected well by international troops? Or did they feel, you know, for example, in places like in UN missions in Haiti, they did not feel particularly safe because they often found that UN military activities in certain neighborhoods actually increased insecurity, broadly speaking, around, surrounding neighborhoods or more generally. And you can see some of that work also in the current work of Nicholas LeMay-Hibert, who does work on zoning and looks at the kinds of ways in which the UN will mark a neighborhood a red zone, or, so that nobody can pass through those zones without permission or without a feeling of security. And these zoning practices had particularly negative effects on the peace-kept, because the peace-kept were the ones most affected by that kind of zoning practices. So that's kind of what we worked on before, but a question kind of pervaded that work and persisted in my mind. And that was about, rather than, what is the experience of peacekeeping for those living and working in peacekeeping missions, I very much started to think about, like, how do we as scholars, as students, as academics, how do we come to know peacekeeping? Like, how do we come to know what constitutes peacekeeping? What is good peacekeeping? What is bad? What should we do in certain situations? How do we come to know that? And so I started to turn to more recently some of the publications, which I'm going to show you on the screen. And I was curious as to why these more recent publications have very little of the kind of work that really informed me when I was starting this research. So if you look at recent publications from, say, 2018 until the present, you will rarely see some of these books that I'm going to show you just the cover pages of. You'll rarely see them cited. They're almost completely erased. So I wanted to know, why was it that certain kind of critical texts that were so informative to me, why did they sort of disappear from the scholarship? Again, this is partly like I'm sharing hopefully new knowledge with you, but maybe something different's been going on here and you've been all reading these books. But I mean, maybe people could just say, like, have you come across any of these books? If you have, on any of your reading lists or any of your research, these are, like, I think the three most important gender texts on peacekeeping, but again, rarely feature. No one? It's okay. Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah. Well, at least now I'm showing you them, and hopefully you can cite them and take them forward. So this book edited by Cynthia Coburn, the late Cynthia Coburn, and Dubravka Zarkov, was such an important book because it was one of the first books which contained a chapter which actually dealt with sexual exploitation and abuse, and not from the perspective of policy or document or prohibition, but actually the researchers who wrote that chapter, one of the writers, Melanie Hubich, actually interviewed women who were working as sex workers in a peacekeeping mission, and interviewed them and asked them, what would make your lives more secure? What would make conditions better, rather than, how can we stop this practice? And that, from 2004, that book from 2004, that chapter is again, almost never cited. And yet it was one of the first pieces with where somebody actually spoke to the individuals who are, more or less now the objects of various types of UN policies and programs. This book the middle book is cited a bit more, Men, Militarism, and UN Peacekeeping, Gendered Approach by Whitworth. Again, one of the really important aspects of this was that there was an early conceptualization of masculinities, military masculinities, and whether these were revealed in, whether these could be sort of examined and analyzed in the context of moving from being soldiers engaged in war or trained for war, and then shifting to humanitarian work. Like, what happens when we put individuals who are trained in organized violence into spaces where they need to negotiate resolutions to conflict, or they need to keep the peace in whatever ways are deemed suitable by the United Nations. And then the latter piece, Gender, Conflict, and Peacekeeping, edited by Diane Mazarana, Angela Raven Roberts, and Jane Parpar. Again, maybe it's something about the edited collections on either sides, chapters in books, which do not tend to get cited in a lot of work in the same way that peer-reviewed journal articles do. But that book also contained a very first type of article as well, which was an article about gender training, which they started to introduce in the early 2000s, so that peacekeepers would be required, military, police, and civilians would be required upon arriving in a peacekeeping mission to undergo a certain amount of gender awareness training. And these have really shifted over time. It's something that I'm concerned about in a new project, which is to look at how gender changed, the subject of gender changed throughout that training. But that was one of the books that talked about gender training first and what the importance of it. Okay, so some books that you don't see very often. And these books were explicitly feminist. The post-war moment was explicitly anti-militarist as well. So it was not about reforming peacekeeping or reforming soldiers. It was an expose on all the things wrong with a kind of version of martial peace that where gender was not sufficiently analyzed. So then there were these other books. These ones on the end were, this is all around 2004, beginning in 2004, these critical texts. These two on the end were sort of circulated less in the scholarship, although Pouligny's work is cited quite a bit. But the first book is probably, well, for me, one of the most influential books, which again is not cited very often in contemporary work. And this work by Razek, by Shireen Razek, was an expose of violence committed by Canadian peacekeepers. I know, shock horror, which was why she wrote it, because this myth of Canada as this completely organically peaceful and naturally sort of non-violent place irritated her, and so she wrote this piece exposing this really terrible case of violence committed by peacekeepers on Somali people in the late 90s. So in this piece, Razek uses this explicitly post-colonial critique, and she uses critical race theory to talk about how peacekeeping exemplifies a kind of a global color line, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit. And what she says is peacekeeping is essentially, you know, as other scholars have said, is essentially a civilizing mission. It's about global North countries teaching global South countries how to be peaceful. The Somali affair, as it was called in Canada, went wrong and was narrated by Canadians in a number of ways. So in order to preserve the myth of Canadians as quintessentially peaceful, the Canadian soldiers blamed a number of things for the acts of violence. So Canadian peacekeepers talked about how the heat and the dust literally made them crazy, made them unable to behave. It had resonances with Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness arguments, which were about the kind of, the kind of fog that apparently takes place when soldiers or when those from the global North are stationed for too long in places like Africa or in conflict countries more generally. So that's a really important piece. I think, in learning about what constitutes peacekeeping. And then these other two pieces really focus on Kimberly Zisk-Martin's piece focuses on the imperial past. So it's much more of a historical account of how you can't ignore the past when you send peacekeepers in, because there is this legacy of how militaries and how organizations like the UN have already engaged. And then Pouligny's was one of the first books which actually reflected this engagement with local people. So Pouligny was talking to local individuals, local organizers, local groups, asking them what they thought of UN peacekeeping and what they thought were the solutions. So a really important variation on what you see in contemporary peacekeeping scholarship. Okay, I'm going to go through a little bit quicker because I've got loads of books to talk about, but some more books that are not cited. This is not a plug for my earlier book to be cited, but just some examples of, when work doesn't fit certain kinds of conventions, and when it focuses on certain kinds of critical topics, how it can be so easily, I think, pushed to the margins. Robert Rubenstein is anthropologist, military anthropologist, spent time looking at sort of cultural symbols and the cultural work of peacekeepers in a number of places. In Insecure Spaces, that's where myself and Paul Highgate started to think about the peacekeeping as a socio-spatial power project, where we looked at the ways in which UN peacekeeping comes and just takes over, literally, physically takes over spaces and reformats those spaces. And then Laura Zanotti's book, Governing Disorder, is very much from a Foucauldian perspective, a critical account of peacekeeping, which says that basically peacekeeping is an attempt to survey and discipline subjects, the peace kept, and so it's much more constructed sort of set of power relations than might otherwise be presented. So there is this critical body of work, and then so then you get this kind of second generation work, which has some critical elements in it, but a lot of this critical scholarship is already starting to slip away from these text bibliographies. This work, which is almost entirely on sexual violence and peacekeeping, the politicization of sexual violence by Carol Harrington. Carol Harrington has a background also working as part of civil society organizations. This fantastic collection, Gender, Sex, and the Post-National Defense, Militarism and Peacekeeping, by Annika Kronzel. And this book in the middle is cited very often, Forces for Good, Claire Duncanson's Military Masculinities and Peace Building in Afghanistan and Iraq. A really important contribution from that book is the idea that, the narrative of peacekeepers as forces for good is a social construction in and of itself. Unfortunately, that book doesn't focus on traditional peacekeeping spaces, so perhaps some of its applicability is limited. This collection, Rethinking Peacekeeping, Gender Equality and Collective Security, is very legally focused. It's a lot of feminist lawyers looking at the different ways in which peacekeeping could be reformed through legal means. So sexual exploitation and abuse by peacekeepers, for example, is written about in relation to, how peacekeepers could be formally prosecuted. The last two books, which focus almost exclusively on female peacekeepers, really interesting. The Women in Blue Helmets, which is about all female squads that have been sent from the Indian police force. But Women in Blue Helmets tends not to significantly address the issue of the fact that almost all of the female peacekeepers sent to missions are from the global south, which is it makes a significant, I think, makes a significant difference about who is doing this majority of work on behalf of gender, and who isn't. And then this comprehensive, it's a huge book, this Equal Opportunity Peacekeeping by Sabrina Karim and Kyle Beardsley. It's a qualitative and quantitative study of everything you can imagine that has to do with female peacekeepers. Again, doesn't really talk about geopolitics, doesn't talk about sort of global forms of racism or inequality, although that's not the point of the book. So it's not an attack on what the book could have done more of. It's just an interesting sort of reflection on what is absent from a relatively comprehensive account. Okay. So again, a whole series of other books that take some critical perspectives, but have been used interestingly by UN officials in different ways. So this last book, UN Peacekeeping Doctrine in a New Era, fascinating, came out in 2017, I think. I have in my notes. So this is a series of chapters about different aspects of peacekeeping. Surprisingly, not one on gender. So you saw all the books that have come before. There's not even a chapter from 2017 on this book, which is, again, pretty comprehensive in terms of covering various relevant issues, but there isn't one on gender. And in fact, I think a search of gender, I think gender doesn't even exist in the index. So just gives you a sense of the ways in which peacekeeping studies and peacekeeping knowledge is moving further and further away from some of those earlier critical texts that I found really formative. And then very recently, you have this book, Violating Peace, Sex, Aid, and Peacekeeping by Jasmine Kim Westendorf. This is a book entirely about sexual exploitation and abuse, and it links sexual exploitation and abuse with conflict-related sexual violence. It actually looks at those two literatures because there's a lot of work on conflict-related sexual violence, brings those two literatures together. And it does talk about colonialism and the ways in which sexual exploitation and abuse can be understood as a form or an extension of the colonial power of the UN. So an important piece. And then this book by Holtman, Kapman, and Shannon is quite cited quite highly, even though it's just recently come out in the last few years. And this is Peacekeeping in the Midst of War. This reflects a pretty significant body of work taking place at Uppsala University in Sweden. There's major data sets, and there's a lot of researchers, and essentially the projects coming out of Uppsala and mostly led by Lisa Holtman argue in a number of ways that peacekeeping is absolutely essential to keep because it saves lives. So a lot of the work that they provide demonstrates the sites where lives were saved in the immediate aftermath or in the immediate deliverance of a peacekeeping mission. So just in the just after a peace agreement or just after some kind of a ceasefire. And Lise Howard piece is so it's Power and Peacekeeping. When I saw the book published, I was like, oh, that's mine, that's my book. But actually it's about where peacekeeping could be so much better. So what Howard argues is that the benchmark for peacekeeping right now is very low. Like what makes for a good peacekeeping mission is extremely low standards. Like, and in fact, you have lots of peacekeeping commanders or peacekeeping Secretary General representatives saying things like, this peacekeeping mission was successful. And one of the reasons it was successful was because nothing bad happened. So Howard really kind of takes issue with that and says, like, what could be so much better about peacekeeping as if the standards were raised higher. So Howard's not particularly interested in critiquing peacekeeping's origins in the way that I am, but very much calls out this very sort of low quality level that has been perpetuated over time. And then I just thought it was really interesting that somebody wrote a novel on peacekeeping, because why would you? Well, you're here today, so maybe you'll read it, but it is a little bit of a niche subject. I just think it's interesting. And I don't know if anyone's seen, but there are a couple of films related to peacekeeping. There's a film about sexual exploitation and abuse, for example, in the Balkans, and there's also a film about that features peacekeepers, Canadian and Belgian peacekeepers in the context of Rwanda. It's got different names and different translations, but it's partly based on a number of fictional pieces, and then there's also a number of novels written on peacekeeping as well. Okay, so I've done this huge journey through these books and texts. Is that my phone? Sorry, no, okay. So I've done this journey, and I was thinking, okay, so this is how I come to know peacekeeping, but what could I transmit, or what could I share with other people as to what the problem is if you don't go through this route? Because you're never going to go through this route. You can't do all this stuff that I've done for the book. So you can probably hopefully just read the abstract for my book or the summary for my book. No, I'm just really curious as to why why we abandon in peacekeeping scholarship or in humanitarian studies or in peace and conflict studies, why we abandon some of these more critical perspectives, the perspectives that came from feminists and from gender studies scholars, the perspectives that came from anti-militarists, those who were really interested in challenging the continuing negative effects of a kind of martial approach to peace, and those that were interested in offering an approach that looked at the roots of peacekeeping, the foundational roots, the epistemic roots, the practical roots in colonial thinking. So I wanted to know why those ideas didn't persist in the scholarship. I wanted to just give you maybe a couple of examples to show you what I mean. So I showed you the cover of Shireen Razik's book, Dark Threats, White Knights. And I actually had the book when I was doing my field work in 2005, 2006, and I was in Liberia. And as part of this early research that I told you about, which originally started being about sexual exploitation and abuse, and then became very quickly about sort of general experiences of insecurity and security, we were interviewing, me and a couple of colleagues, we were interviewing civilian, police, and military peacekeepers about their own experiences. And we were interviewing local people from different organizations, civil society organizations, but people who had lived and worked in peacekeeping missions. And so I had this book in my bag, and I was meeting a couple of civilian peacekeepers. They'd helped facilitate our research, and we would often get together with some of them who had provided us access around the country for coffee or dinner or lunch. And so I had this book sort of sticking out of my bag. And one of the civilian peacekeepers, he was like, "Oh, what's that book that you've got in your bag?" So I pulled it out, And he said, oh, well, what's that book about? So I sort of gave him the synopsis of the book without perhaps revealing the extent to which she tracks the violence perpetrated by Canadian peacekeepers. But I say, oh, essentially, she argues that peacekeeping is a colonial project, which is really the summary of the book. And so then all of these civilian peacekeepers that we were working with got really, really agitated. And they were like, no way is peacekeeping a colonial project. You know, that's just not possible. It doesn't work. And then we started talking about, oh, you know, what's your take on this? What's it informed by? So most of them had been studying, had postgraduate degrees from various universities from Sweden in development studies and peace and conflict studies. Some of them had master's degrees in human rights. Some of them had master's degrees from my institution, from LSE. So they had really the kind of, you know, the educational capital, and they also had the critical insights. So they were not coming from very conservative programs. They were not coming from black letter law or, you know, formal normative sort of disciplinary perspectives. They were already sort of exposed to critical perspectives. And they were like, no way that peacekeeping can be ever captured by colonialism. That's just, you know, and then they sort of gave me a definition of what colonialism was. And I was like, okay, that does sound like colonialism, but I wonder if, you know, we might want to extend this or think about other ways in which. So it really, that's one of the fieldwork insights that I think stayed with me was, you know, what are the kind of investments that we have in attaching ourselves to a certain story about peacekeeping. And in the scholarship, what you see is a lot of, so I would classify most of the early work as critical peacekeeping studies or critical studies on peacekeeping, but there's a whole body of work, which I haven't shown you. And that body of work is more or less problem solving. And that work is interested in, well, and debates what are the best ways. Maybe Howard's is and Holtman's, I'm not sure, is necessarily problem solving. It's more providing evidence of what works. But Howard's is much more about, you know, like what we need to do to reform peacekeeping to make it more effective. None of that early stuff. In fact, Razik's conclusion in her book is about how she doesn't want to provide any answers for her critique of peacekeeping. She doesn't want to come up with solutions that would make peacekeeping better or would eliminate these violent events that take place at the hands of peacekeepers. That's not what her project is. Her project is to critique, in particular, the national myth-making that takes place through peacekeeping as an example. So she's really targeting Canada in particular in the book, but she definitely doesn't have any solutions to offer. And so I think that's one of the things that I want to do in this project is to move away from that. Okay, well, how do we make peacekeeping better? How do we reform it? Okay, so I just want to take you through a couple of theories that I found meaningful to help justify this abolitionist argument that I'm making about the end of peacekeeping. So one of the concepts that Razik uses and that I use in the book is the global color line. And what Razik says is, you know, so in quoting critical race theorist, Black radical theorist, W.E.B. Du Bois, she quotes, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. The relation of the darker to the lighter of races of men in Asia and Africa, in America and the islands of the sea." What she does by drawing on these ideas is to say that actually peacekeeping reflects this global color line. It reflects it even to the point of who the peacekeepers are. So one of the questions that was continually raised, not only around, you can't say peacekeeping is a colonial project, but whenever there were examples of, I would construct, say, sexual exploitation and abuse as a reflection of colonial power or colonial, power as expressed in unequal relations. People would say, yes, but, look at this report or look at this newspaper article. This group of peacekeepers from this place were caught sexually exploiting and abusing local girls or local women. And they are from Ghana, or they are from Nigeria, or they are from this. So then they would say, so it can't be, it can't be that these spaces are colonial, because you have these individuals who are enacting this power, and they're not from a colonizing country. And what Razik says is actually the global color line. If you think through that, the global color line as a lens, what you see is that peacekeeping spaces are sites of colonial scripts. They're sites where colonial scripts are enacted. So peacekeeping as a space is a stage for enacting colonial power. So in a way, what Razik suggests is it doesn't matter who the peacekeeper is individually, that this power permeates the space. It permeates the kinds of interactions that are enabled. So this is why I think I'm very much compelled by this kind of critical intervention. Another concept which I draw on to think through the ways in which sexual exploitation and abuse, for example, has been approached by scholars and practitioners. So one of the main issues in addressing sexual violence and sexual exploitation at the hands of peacekeepers is that the UN's very concerned about their image, and so they don't want stories of sexual exploitation and abuse to continually come out. But as you can probably imagine, they've been coming out pretty well every year since, Whitworth dates it back to the very short transitional peacekeeping mission in Cambodia, which was a very short period of time. So actually, this has been going on for a long time. And one of the critical approaches that I use to conceptualize this is to think about the coloniality of gender. So one of the policy responses, or one of the practical responses, has been, I don't know if anybody knows about this, but very recently there's been a no sex policy implemented. So the United Nations has appointed a victims advocate, and the victims advocate is supposed to be a somewhat arm's length individual who deals with complaints of sexual exploitation and abuse and tries to find perpetrators of this and discipline them accordingly. But in the meantime, the victims advocate has also suggested that all military sending troops sign up to an informal policy of not only no fraternization, so no socializing with the local population, but also a no sex rule, so that individuals would be deployed to a mission and would be expected not to have sex the entire time that they are deployed. I don't know if I can't imagine any employer in any context, in any industry, being able to mandate this kind of employee policy. Yeah, maybe the church, the Catholic Church only, perhaps, but that didn't really work. So I guess it would be about, what the enforcement mechanisms would be. Again, really interesting, because troops then, in order to be sort of selected, or in order to narrate themselves as the good guys who won't be involved in this kind of thing, will then say, well, we've implemented this. We've taken this on board. We've embraced this. you know, and I'm really struck by this one fieldwork visit that I had with a peacekeeper colleague who was taking me to visit Nigerian battalion in Liberia. And when we got to the battalion, when we got to the base and we were, you know, wanting to ask, we weren't even at, this project wasn't even about sexual exploitation and abuse. This was really about the kinds of activities that peacekeepers were engaged in. And from the moment that we arrived, the commander just kept mentioning like that we're not involved in any sexual exploitation and abuse. Like he did not know that I'd previously published on this. We hadn't mentioned anything. So it was interesting that he kept bringing it up. And then when I was asking about, you know, what kinds of activities your troops are involved in, you know, charity work, philanthropic work, which is quite common for peacekeepers, he was getting really edgy and he just kept saying, we don't fraternize with local people. None of my soldiers have been in trouble. And we've had a really successful, like it was just a few days before a new contingent was, or a new battalion was going to be put in place. And he kept saying, you know, everything has gone really, really well here. So, nothing bad happening is an example of success. So one of the kinds of theoretical devices that I feel was inspired by the earlier work is really around coloniality and the coloniality of gender. And so I very much take from Maria Ligonas's work, where she talks about the ways in which a classification system that divided people according to what she calls a multiple intersectional factors, including gender, class, and ethnicity, was used. And what Ligonas argues is that actually many women were not included in the category human. They were in fact excluded from the category human. So that colonialism worked to acknowledge some elements of gender. So some women were included in the category, but other women were excluded. When I look at the ways in which the UN approaches sexual exploitation and abuse, I very much think back on this coloniality of gender, because actually what you get is you get a kind of a policy or a mandate by the UN that assumes that women in peacekeeping missions, peace-kept women, are incapable of any form of consent or any form of agency, so that they are labeled as victims of male peacekeepers, or they're labeled as victims of peacekeepers. And such, there needs to be these kinds of no sex policies, or there needs to be a kind of policy which says there's no gray areas, it doesn't matter if people, in fact, they actually say in training, consent doesn't matter. What they mean is it doesn't matter if someone consented, it's still sexual exploitation and abuse. But when they say consent doesn't matter, it's actually quite worrying for a number of other reasons, because it creates this idea that that there is no such thing as consensual relations, because you're in a place of extreme economic and social vulnerability of the peace kept, and therefore they have no agency. They're almost non-human. They're just a part of the policy. They become a kind of object of the policy and not actually real individuals. This, I think, is also reflected in the kind of the writing on sexual exploitation and abuse that comes out more recently, which doesn't have an explicitly feminist necessarily an explicitly feminist approach. So when I mentioned equal opportunity peacekeeping, the piece, Sabrina Karim and Kyle Beardsley have also written quite a lot on sexual exploitation and abuse. And some of the arguments are that if you introduce female peacekeepers to missions, if you increase the number of female peacekeepers, you will definitely get a decrease in incidents of sexual exploitation and violence. Of course, this also assumes a certain kind of certain forms of violence and certain forms of sex segregation, right? So it assumes that it's mostly male peacekeepers who are committing acts of violence, and it assumes that male peacekeepers are committing acts of violence against the peace kept, not against their fellow colleagues. Okay, so How much time do I have?
50.
Okay, good. Okay, so yeah, so the other theoretical concept that I think is missing in the more recent work is very much evident in the early work by, I don't have any books up on my slides by Enloe, but there's almost too many. I can't put them all up, but Cynthia Enloe's work has been instrumental in a lot of these critical perspectives. But in the work by Cynthia Coburn and in all of her work, you see a reflection of the concept or the political concept of feminist standpoint. And Coburn's books, for example, all have, a reference to feminist standpoint theory. So feminist standpoint theory, which I locate in critical race theory, in feminist epistemology, is very much based on this idea that lived experience should form the basis for the production of knowledge, so that what you experience and from where you are located shapes how you view the world and what forms of knowledge you use. So, I think that's very much reflected in my book about how we come to know, or how I came to know, peacekeeping. It's very much influenced by my own trajectory through gender studies, through politics and international studies, through development studies. And so I think what feminists argued in those early works was that, okay, well, why are we not looking at peacekeeping from the perspective of the peace kept? And so if you look at those last texts that some of these are a bit earlier, but aside from Pouleney's work, virtually none of the texts that follow are about the peace kept, actually. None of them are about peacekeeping from the lives of the people whose lives are being secured, right? Or the people whose lives are being affected. Women in blue helmets and equal opportunity peacekeeping obviously are about peacekeepers. But again, yeah, virtually none of this. And if we think about that chapter that I mentioned in Coburn and Zarkov's book, that is about sex workers' lives. None of this work is really interested in the perspectives of the peace kept. And so that's one of the ways in which, if we pay attention to the kind of conceptual or the theoretical contribution of that early work, we might think about emphasizing different perspectives in peacekeeping. So in fact, as I said, studies of peacekeeping missions have almost exclusively focused on, for example, female peacekeepers, with very little account of local women's everyday lives. The peace kept as subjects in their own right feature marginally in this new era of peacekeeping studies. And then, as I already suggest, peace kept women feature as instrumental to larger peacekeeping questions about effectiveness, operations, and logistics, as well as in relation to participation in post-conflict reconstruction. So peace kept women, you could say, in a way, are the sort of the group of individuals that are given the least amount of attention. I think a feminist standpoint perspective, as Coburn argues for in all of her work. So one of her texts is called From Where We Stand. Another book on post-conflict experiences in Cyprus is called On the Line. And it's always about, from which perspective do we start writing about these conditions and these processes. So another concept that Razek partially introduces, and I think that is not explicitly in this early work, but is definitely inspired by, is the concept of intersectionality. I'm hoping that you've all been introduced to it. Yes? If not, perhaps you want to read that important key piece by Crenshaw, but don't read only Crenshaw's piece on intersectionality if you can. But I was struck by rereading this early work, that actually this early work, the work by Enloe and by Coburn and by Whitworth, even though it doesn't invoke the concept of intersectionality, it's very much interested in critiquing structural systems or structural conditions. It's not interested in reforming those conditions. It's interested in exposing power and power relations and calling for, some kind of abolition of patriarchy or capitalism or colonialism. So I think intersectionality allows us to maintain that kind of critical perspective. And some of the ways in which I do this in the book is to look at the introduction of female peacekeepers from the Global South. So female peacekeepers from the Global South make up the bulk of female peacekeepers, right? So just think of the Indian military as having 1 million soldiers, okay? At least 250,000 are on the border of Kashmir, probably a lot more in the last few years. And on average, the Indian military has about 10,000 soldiers circulating in various missions. And then you think about the group that female peacekeepers are coming from. So the Central Reserve Police Force is also very large. And then you'd have a pool of about 4,000 women that would be available for peacekeeping. So 4,000 women is quite a significant group of peacekeepers. So in 2007, the Indian government decided to send these all-female squads to first to Liberia, and then they trialed it in a number of other places. Bangladesh also sent an all-female squad to Haiti, and various groups of women were then sent to Democratic Republic of Congo and some other places. What I found fascinating was that there was an assumption on the part of the UN that by sending female peacekeepers and sending Global South female peacekeepers, that there would be some kind of sisterhood, some kind of connection between those peacekeepers and local women. And perhaps there might be some inspiration to improve the lives of local women. What I found was actually a little bit of a sort of a mismatch. So first of all, the Indian women police that were sent were in no way trained on gender, other than the kind of gender training that everyone gets in mission. In fact, actually, these women who were sent were riot police experts. They were weapons experts. They were they offered close protection security, but they didn't have any kind of conflict resolution skills. They didn't have any skills that enabled them to address victims of sexual and conflict-related violence, for example. They didn't have any of those skills at all. And actually what happened was that, in fact, these women believed that they were very, very different from local women and that they had no connection with local women. There was, in fact, the opposite of sisterhood. They felt quite, they continually reiterated their own sort of respectability above local women. So in fact, I used the concept of intersectionality inspired by this earlier critical work to think about the ways in which differences amongst women actually contributed to this or challenged this idea that somehow if we just sort of add women and stir, it'll all work out, or that there'll be some kind of natural connection. And actually work in the Swedish context, for example, or in the Norwegian context, demonstrated that actually sending men with gendered expertise that had specialized in, for example, setting up domestic violence cells in the police, or who'd somehow done some further research on gendered relations, were actually much better suited to doing the kind of work that was the invisible labor that was put on these Indian women. So actually what intersectionality did for me as a conceptual lens was allow me to pay attention to not only the ways in which women were oppressed by, so if I think about the Indian women peacekeepers, they were not only sort of marginalized within this masculine and male dominated environment, but they were also privileged vis-a-vis the peace-kept women. So intersectionality allowed me to see the multiple ways in which people are either oppressed or subjugated and or privileged. Okay, yeah. Okay, so the last sort of critique that I make and that I take inspiration from was the anti-militarist perspectives of early scholars. So they were extremely critical, as I said, of sending soldiers, trained soldiers, to missions or to contexts where people had just experienced very high levels of interpersonal and communal and political violence. So again, I was struck by the more recent publications. And one of the more recent publications that I haven't shown you is one that is influenced by, so the UN commissioned former force commander, former military commanders and peacekeeping scholars to write a report on what the UN could do to improve peacekeeping's effectiveness. Well, you'll not be surprised that the former commander, who was part of the team, argued that actually more military technology, more military might, a different kind of much more focused military intervention in peacekeeping would produce better results, would save more lives, would be less, would be cost effective, and would be overall for militaries who were reluctant to send their personnel would be better because it would reduce the number of people that had to be sent. And in this way, one of the pictures that I showed you on the global color line was a picture of a peacekeeper funeral where peacekeepers had been killed. And I can ask you what you think about who do you think is the peacekeepers most likely to die while on duty? What sort of countries do you think, what kind of regions do you think peacekeepers come from more broadly? Anybody know? You know what? United States has the fewest number of peacekeepers under the UN. In fact, they're averse to sending peacekeepers. They send some police, but very few. I think they probably have one of the smallest, but they contribute the most money to peacekeeping. So you can give them that, but yeah. Yeah. Yeah, they often are deployed in Africa, but they have been deployed. So for example, Ugandan, Kenyan, Tanzanian, Nigerian, Ghanaian peacekeepers, military peacekeepers have been posted previously in the Balkans. Yeah. Actually, the largest group of peacekeepers are from the global south. So the largest troop contributing are India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Ghana, Nigeria, and then you also have Jordan. You have so not the US, not Canada, not Sweden. Germany and Austria, not so much anymore. People are averse to it in Europe. Yeah. So if you think about the kinds of ways in which militaries have been trying to kind of reinvent themselves, then it's not surprising that this report that came out by the peacekeeping scholar and by the former commander argues for revamping military means, actually. And some of the big push has come from the southern cone of Latin America. So Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Uruguay have been sending fairly large numbers of military personnel and have been very keen to have more military purpose in peacekeeping missions. So I argue in the book that peacekeeping remains underpinned by these colonial forms of militarism and militarization, because they believe that military might is the ultimate sort of solution to these humanitarian and conflict crises. And it's not like these, as I argue, it's not like peacekeeping has been increasingly securitized or militarized from nowhere. You know, there have been, you know, agendas, and one of the agendas, for example, of India, but also Argentina, Brazil, in contributing all female squads or contributing, you know, peacekeepers whenever they're needed, is also so that countries can get, you know, a seat at the security table or a seat on the Security Council. And I think these martial roots of peacekeeping have been hidden, submerged, and smoothed over. And so when you see something like equality, opportunity, peacekeeping, or you see there's a whole new, maybe some of you have been following, there's a whole new podcast on peacekeeping set up by the UN. So you can listen to different experts talk about, you know, what's the latest in peacekeeping. And none of it actually acknowledges really the martial roots of peacekeeping, which are to use, you know, to use force as a deterrent, but nevertheless to use military power, to use martial means. So I think I have some concluding thoughts, but I think I'll come to them in the questions much more naturally. So I think I'll stop there and take some questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Marsha. This was really educational. I think the students have now a whole library of books that they need to read.
I'm sorry, they're all in English.
Yeah, you should apologize. No, it was really nice, really educational. Thanks a lot. We do have 20 minutes for question and answers. We have a microphone here, and if we're starting in a minute, so you can maybe take a sip of water.
Yeah.
If you use it, don't be irritated. It won't make your voice louder in the room. It's just for the recording. So you speak as loudly as you can, but use the mic so the people online can hear you as well. It's a bit confusing. All right. Who would like to ask a question? Yes, please. As you wish, but could you introduce yourself?
Yeah.
If you hit it, people on the internet will hear.
People somewhere way far away will
It's
be
fine, don't worry.
Okay, I am a research fellow on gender peace and security from Peace Research Institute down in Frankfurt, and I have two strictly gender-related questions.
Okay.
And the second one is I'm trying to connect the observation of you, Marsha, of the sad loss in male-female vision of peacekeeping to the other branch of the work, which is on the racialized knowledge production of the PS. To then what are the implications you think for trends in peacekeeping, especially gender in peacekeeping, of the rise of alternative peacekeeping actors, where they might not be the traditional gender champions. I'm speaking totally on behalf of my own country, yes, China. And the second is probably a bit broad, but I still like to ask, what do you think are the ways to address gender in the design, delivery, and aftermath peacekeeping when when peacekeeping is obviously that without or an alternative, and it's gonna be there for a while, and codes of conduct, quota politics, or operational gender training have all proved to be not quite working. And yeah, those are my questions. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? Should we collect a couple of them?
Sure, if you want.
Please really speak into the mic. It's weird, but it only works like that.
Good afternoon. Thanks for your presentation. I have a question regarding the women peacekeepers from the Global South.
Yeah.
I just wonder how all of the discussions about coloniality and about this westernized perspective of these operations influencing the discourses of the people who are working in these territories, more from the Global South and also the locals, and how they start using the discourses as a way of acceptance from this global peace perspective. Because in my experience, I saw that there were a lot of people who were working in the same country. They were working in these kind of peace operations, and they used to have the same discourses as the people who were coming from abroad. These kind of international actors who work in these kind of operations. And also, I would like to ask you, during your fieldwork, during your ethnography, how you saw the agency of these locals, how this agency of these locals tried to transform the perspectives of these peace operations that are really have a lot of gender biases and also have different kind of perspective from this colonial approach, as you mentioned.
Okay.
Thanks so much.
Probably enough for now. Maybe.
Yeah, I think so. Okay, great. Thank you so much. Okay, so in terms of the racialized knowledge project that is peacekeeping, and that's also, you're making reference to women, peace and security agenda. And I mean, of course, they're very much interlinked, because the women, peace and security agenda very much is like a sort of a child of peacekeeping rhetoric in a way. It has a lot of hope in it, and it's very aspirational about what it can achieve. So I guess what to say about, well, one of the things that I argue in the book is that actually what I think happens is that the way in which gender is used in peacekeeping practice and in the scholarship ends up reifying gender and rendering it back to its problematic sort of origins, right? So rather than kind of blow apart gender as a category, it sort of recuperates a very problematic binary between sex and gender. So what you actually get is you get, okay, let's bring the female peacekeepers in because they'll transform the space, and they do transform the space because it's one of the most male dominated besides the church, besides the Catholic Church. I'm going to have to keep putting that in the footnotes, besides the Catholic Church. But because it's such a male dominated enterprise, it's, having a few women does potentially change it. But then there's all these issues about critical mass that you have in terms of electoral politics and political representation. There's this magic number, and you'll hear this at various peacekeeping like conferences and stuff. People will be like, yeah, we've achieved, great success. We have like 33% women, or it's 30% is the threshold. If you reach 30%, you've reached equality, even though that doesn't make any sense. And no one ever says 50%, although recently, I guess a few years ago, the UN implemented a parity project, which is really about 50%. But no one was ever really embarrassed to say, like, we're aiming for 30% and we're at like 7% right now. And we hope to get to 50% by whatever time. So and that's partly the problem with that is because it relies on certain kind of conflations between sex and gender. And and so when you're in the peacekeeping mission, you hear when I was doing field work, but you hear all kinds of things being said that are, that take you back to a version of sex and gender that isn't reflected perhaps in most people's contemporary sort of language of it. So things like, I don't know, people saying things like, well, I don't think we should send all female squads. And it's like, what? You've been sending all male squads for, since the beginning of peacekeeping. So I don't understand what's the problem with sending an all female squad. I mean, the problem is that you then have sex segregated troops, right? Or sex segregated situations. And the purpose of that sex segregation is never really interrogated. So it's like, well, why are these soldiers from the same national military being separated, even though all soldiers are supposed to be the same, right? So I think there's lots of things going on that kind of conflate. And then there's also the issue of the coloniality of gender that I was talking about, which is assuming some women are agentic, some women are capable of consent. That would be global North female peacekeepers, for example, who are capable of making decisions in the course of their work. But peace-kept women, no matter where they're working, are not capable of consenting. I do recognize that it's not that simple. It's not a simple situation. There are clearly unequal power relations between peacekeepers and local people, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all consent should be then subsumed into some kind of, there is still the importance of adult agency. I'm not talking about children in any of these examples. So I'm not sure that 100% answers the first part of your question, but maybe I can come back to it in another way. The second point about codes of conduct and gender awareness and like needing to work with what's there. The victim's advocate, who is partly responsible for the kinds of definitions of gender that are at work, has very strict definitions about sex and gender, and so really believes that it's completely legitimate to ask employees, even though they're international, they're employed by their national military, to ask them to only commit to being deployed or to commit to going out and doing peacekeeping if they can guarantee that they will not have sex during that 6 months or that year. I mean, it's a very old-fashioned idea, first of all, of what people can, like, I mean, to be perfectly frank, this is being recorded. I'm really regretting this now, but they're not. But they're like, I don't understand. I mean, the logic that this victim's advocate used, which was a good logic, is, well, if you want this job, if you want to be deployed, then you have to commit to this requirement. But I was like, well, it really implies that people, first of all, can't do that, or can't do that somehow unless they, I don't know, prepare themselves or are given a financial punishment. And, I was sort of saying, like, we could look out the window and I'm sure we could find like several people on the street who have not had sex in the last 6 months. Like, yeah, definitely cut that out. But I mean, it was just like, it's a weird conceptualization of biological needs and sexual drives. And it's based on very, I think, uninterrogated version of sex and gender and what people, but people will say things like, well, we have needs. And it's just like, well, okay, there's so many discussions about sex and gender that need to take place that don't. So that, in fact, the policies don't reflect contemporary knowledge. And the consent thing is a really interesting thing, because a colleague of mine who's done research on gender training, on gender awareness training, said that people just kept repeating like, oh, they said consent doesn't matter, you know, and we were sort of thinking about how that mantra actually reproduces a kind of an environment where sexual violence then is condoned, even though that's not the origin of that particular conversation. So I think there's, yeah, and I think that one more thing to add to that is just about so the early gender awareness training programs that I observed in my field work, so in the early 2000s, actually they had a whole component on masculinity. What is masculinity? They had, obviously, because the trainings were taking place in peacekeeping missions, the majority of people taking the training were men, were soldiers. And then over time, they've moved, because the topics were so difficult, they couldn't cover them in these short training times, because people would be like, well, that doesn't chime with where I'm from and what the cultural norms are in my society. And then after a while, the gender advisors were like, okay, we can't cover everything to do with gender. And so this training was becoming, sort of useless. Well, it was becoming like a gender studies master's degree rather than a 2-hour or 1-day training session. So it became incompatible. And then over time, what's happened is all those sort of concepts that actually were very worthy to study and to think about, like masculinity and, masculinity as a performance, or masculinity as an illustration of gender power, those became sort of eliminated from the training documents. And then what you got is, you can actually see a version of this now, which is gender as a technology. So it's something that then is put through various different topics and areas. And then you can sort of tick off, okay, this is my definition of gender, and then this is how I understand it. And then everything's all complete and fine. And as long as people understand what gender is, they've completed the gender awareness training. So I think there is something going on with the definitions of gender and sex. They're being conflated in different ways. Different people have different approaches to them, and then they're put into policy and programming. And I think they don't match the kinds of discussions that we're having about what constitutes gender and what constitutes sex in wider society and in the wider scholarship. Sorry, that was a really long answer. I won't be that long answering yours. So I was really fascinated by one of the fieldwork trips that one of the fieldwork studies that I did was with the Uruguayan female peacekeepers. And so they had a very different, they used very different narratives about local women than the Indian women police that I spoke to. So the Uruguayan women were very, first of all, one thing that they had in common with the Indian women police was that they more or less refused to acknowledge that there was any kind of general form of discrimination against them on the basis that they were women. So they constantly talked about how they were trained exactly like their male colleagues. They never experienced any discrimination. They wore the same uniforms. They did the same tasks. So they often had like a rotation system of tasks. Everyone would have to bake. Everyone would have to do the laundry. And so they emphasize that in their narratives. But then when you ask them about like, what rank are you? And so how long until you get to the next rank? And they were like, well, actually I was held back, and I think it's because I'm a woman. And so they would tell you narratives that then contradicted what they'd said earlier. So I think actually they had at least two narrative strategies. One was to cope with the fact that they were in a male-dominated and patriarchal institution. And so they needed to talk about equality all the time in order to kind of survive on a daily basis. But then they were quite interested to also pick out the places and the areas in which they experienced inequality. So the other thing is that the Uruguayan peacekeepers, they talked very differently about local women, but they still used a progress narrative. So they were very empathetic to the conditions of poverty that local women in Haiti, for example, were experiencing. So they showed a lot of compassion, but how they understood it was that they understood local women as experiencing what they had experienced in the past. So they saw themselves as emerging from some kind of linear version of evolution of society and development. And so they had empathy, but they positioned themselves as above those women. So they could see the class politics working out in front of them, but they didn't see themselves as being in the same positions. So that was kind of interesting. And I thought that again, was, I think, helped by my use of intersectionality, because it made me pay attention to the different axes on which people are positioned. And then as far as local people's perceptions, there was loads of examples of resistance by local people to all kinds of practices that peacekeepers have. And one that really stayed with me was that a Balkan peacekeeper that I interviewed talked about, so he was again, this is like a perfect person to send to do peacekeeping work. He was like special forces, basically. So he was in what is the most violent wing of martial forces in his country. And he had his own martial arts training. So he was a black belt in jiu-jitsu, and he thought it would be a really good idea to set up self-defense classes for local people. So he arranged this, a couple of sessions. He told people in the local community, I'm going to put these on. And so he decided he got a space that was sufficient for it so that he could give them some sort of theoretical background, sort of physical background, and then do some physical demonstrations. And he thought it would be good. He brought like biscuits and some other food and drink. And on the first day, so he was going to do this over a couple of weeks. And on the first day, there was probably about 12 people. They showed up. They were really keen. They ate all the biscuits and the drinks. And then they left. And then the next week, there was like 4 people. After it was 12, they ate all the biscuits and the drink. One person left like pretty soon after. And then he was like, okay. And then the third week that he put this on, there was like one person who came. And then he was like, okay, I'm not supplying, he was quite angry. And he was like, I'm not supplying biscuits and drinks for people. This is what's wrong with these people. They don't understand how to make their lives better. And it was really interesting because he was talking about his own experiences having been the peace kept. So it was a really insightful kind of reversal. So he had, and he complained that he had been peace kept by peacekeepers from East Africa, and that he was now in Africa, teaching people how to. He was not in East Africa; he was in West Africa, but he was teaching people how to take care of themselves. And so he felt like this was some kind of, again, this idea of progress and development, and then somehow he was back in his rightful place. And so I think that local people resisted individual peacekeepers and peacekeepers as a collective, and they resisted the institution of peacekeeping in various ways to various degrees of success and failure. Yeah.
Thank you. We're almost out of time. I think I would just like to give you the opportunity to make a concluding statement if you want.
I've spoken enough. I probably shouldn't.
No, because as you mentioned, there maybe is a conclusion. Maybe you can also invite us into the current state of thinking. What is the conclusion to the book or to your thought about the topic?
Yeah, I think, I haven't talked a lot about the abolitionist perspective that I take up in the book and in the conclusion. But yeah, I guess I find that, maybe you'd like to argue with me differently. So I invite you to do that at some point, wherever that's possible, maybe in your essays. But Felix and others will be marking. You can have your moan as well. Maybe others, but yeah, I guess I find that if we go back to these critical theories and we apply them to the peacekeeping context or other humanitarian contexts more broadly, if we find that their patriarchal roots are still present, the colonial roots are still present, and the martial impetus is still present, then really we have no choice but to argue for the end of peacekeeping, really. Because if we're going to argue for the end of the police in the US, or maybe you're not arguing for that, but if you are, you know, if Black Lives Matters, then, you know, Black Lives Matters in so many, I think that we can argue for the abolition of all kinds of armed forces more broadly. And I think we don't need to, apologize for that. Okay.
Thank you very
Thanks.
much indeed. Just one more sentence announcing next week's lecture, which will be totally different, I think. It's delivered by a person whose name I cannot yet pronounce, but I'll learn it until next week. I think it's probably Guy Elcherot. I don't know, but he is from Lausanne, so this might be it. How conflicts change a social psychological perspective on political violence and collective identity. I hope to see you then again. And again, thank you very, very much for making the journey from the UK to the EU. Yeah, thanks again.